Greetings and good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hope you're having a fantastic day and week. Welcome to our live weekly YouTube readings of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force right here on the CJEC YouTube channel. This is the only live reading of California Reparations Task Force's final report on YouTube. The final report of the first in the nation California Reparations Task Force is one of, if not the most, important government reports about the Black American community since the 1960s. Equally important is also the foundation for current and future reparation legislation in California. The report is nearly 1,100 pages long, and we are bringing every page of it to you, chapter by chapter, every week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. PST, so that you are properly educated in your advocacy for reparations in California. Today's reading of the final report is presented to you as a community service with support from the Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team at the Coalition for Just and Equitable California. CJEC is California's leading grassroots organization born for reparations and reparative justice for Black American freedom living in California. For more info on CJEC and our work helping to enact the law that created the California Reparations Task Force, California's law requiring state agencies to collect data on descendants of U.S. slavery that act to end current slavery in California's state prisons, the California's Freedom Affair Bill, and more, visit www.cjecofficial.org. Before we go any further, right now I need you to do three things. First, connect to our YouTube channel by liking this video, hitting the bell for reminders, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Second, get connected to us on social media by following CJEC on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter/X. CJEC Official. Finally, get informed and involved. To do that, visit www.cjecofficial.org to sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page, and support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on our homepage of our website. Special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. You can learn more about our fiscal sponsor at the California Black Women's Health Project at www.cabwhp.org. By way of introduction, my name is Marchand, and I am working with my grandmother, Raphael H. Plunkett. She is a volunteer reparations advocate with CJEC's Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team. The agenda for today, Chapter 32 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. The title of today's chapter we're reading tonight, Harm and Repair. You can follow along in the reading. Download tonight's chapter or the full final report yourself by going to our website, www.cjecofficial.org/reports. Okay, we're about ready to start our reading, but before we do, I have some special thanks and announcements to make. First, as always, I'd like to thank our good friends at ETM Media Group on YouTube for their live readings of the first California Reparations Report. You can watch their readings of the first report on their channel at ETM Media Group on YouTube and on our website, www.cjecofficial.org/videos. Second, for those of you who don't know, historic reparations legislation in California is here, and more is coming. 490 is California's first lineage-based reparations-related legislation to establish the California American Freedom Affairs Agency. The bill was introduced by State Senator Stephen Bradford and will move forward this year. To read the bill, visit www.cjecofficial.org/advocacy. Third, as mentioned, more historic reparation bills are coming. Over the next several months, more reparation bills will be written. During this 2024 legislative sessions, we'll see those bills introduced and start moving toward passage by majorities of both the California State Assembly and Senate. To pass reparation bills in 2024, we need 41 Assembly members and 21 senators to say yes. When those bills are passed, we need our governor to sign the bills. So, to make reparations a reality in California, the math is 41 plus 21 plus 1. That's 41 Assembly members, 21 senators, and 1 governor. 41 plus 21 plus 1 equals reparations in California. Lastly, but not least, special thanks to CJEC's reparation organizing and mobilizing teams, specifically our volunteer final report readers. And without further ado, here's my grandmother, Raphael, reading Chapter 32 of the California Reparations Task Force's final report.
Good evening. This is Raphael H. Plunkett, continuing Chapter 32, Part 4, at page 952, Employment, Forced Labor, and Business Hardship. Collectively, harms related to employment, forced labor, and business hardships represent the most discussed theme of harm. Every narrator reported at least one, and often multiple, accounts of harm that either they or their family members experienced while working. Broadly, the sub-themes can be categorized as histories of enslaved and forced labor in California and the rest of the U.S., gatekeeping practices and elusive barriers to entry, reliance on their expertise but restrictions on their career advancement, lack of social capital. Histories of forced labor, a grandfather enslaved in California and a grandmother and former sharecropper currently living in California. 4 of the 7 narrators gave accounts of their grandparents who were either enslaved persons or sharecroppers in the United States. When considering the contemporary relevance of these narrators' accounts of their elders, it should be noted that of these 4 individuals who experienced forms of bondage, one was enslaved in California. Additionally, another, who was a sharecropper in Arkansas, is still alive today. Finally, one narrator, aged 88 years, gave a personal account of forced labor after wrongful imprisonment. Enslavement in California. Foundational Black Americans' great-grandfather lived in California as early as the mid-1800s, appearing on the 1850 census. Foundational Black American. Well, it's my understanding that my great-grandfather was enslaved in Kentucky or Tennessee and brought to California as a slave. Name removed. A decorated historian reached out to our family in 2006, I believe. The document she shared stated that our great-grandfather, not only was he sold once, but he was sold twice here in the state of California. Ties to slavery in the city of Oakland. Another narrator also reported to a history of enslavement within California. In describing a lawsuit that he attempted to file against the city of Oakland, Bishop Porter indicated that enslaved labor was used to build the Port of Oakland and Oakland railroads. Consistent with Bishop Porter's report, according to a City of Oakland memo authored by Mary Mayberry, interim director of the Department of Workplace and Employment Standards, and distributed on April 13, 2022, the City of Oakland enacted the City of Oakland Slavery Era Disclosure Ordinance in 2005. The ordinance was intended to promote the full and accurate disclosure to the public of the scope of historical ties to slavery within Oakland and create a fund for contractors subject to the ordinance to voluntarily contribute to, quote, promote healing and assist in remedying the present-day legacy of slavery, end quote. Among contractors potentially subject to this ordinance were any textile, tobacco, railroad, shipping, rice, and/or sugar company doing business with the city. Legacy of sharecropping. 3 narrators attested that their grandparents were sharecroppers. Ronnie Lynn's grandfather was a sharecropper in Alabama who served in World War II and moved to California. The man whose blood remembers grandmother, born in the 1920s, began sharecropping at 8 years old, attending school for only half a day. His grandmother was threatened with a loaded gun and rescued her brother from a fire pit while she was still a child. And the man whose blood remembers recounted she experienced familial separation due to sharecropping. The man whose blood remembers. She also mentioned to me that her mother and her father both wasn't on the same farm that she was on, that they lived on a different farm, and that she lived with her auntie. And so, what at first, she didn't know that that was her auntie. She thought it was her mom. She ended up finding out later when she got older. But even her father and her mother was on different farms too. So they weren't even together on the same farm. So they were, like, separated. Gatekeeping. Navigating elusive barriers to entry. While narrators' accounts of employment discrimination and hardship have been categorized into sub-themes to identify specific elements, often the accounts illustrated more than one type of harm. The man whose blood remembers. I'd apply for a position that I was well qualified for, because of the way that I talk, right? They say, yeah, sure, come on in. But the thing is, nobody can lie with their eyes, like the way they look at you. Gatekeeping is used here to describe a phenomenon by which access to opportunities is barred without a clear rationale. Gatekeeping was a recurring theme in employment-related harms, particularly for narrators at transition points in which they sought new employment or business development opportunities. Beginning with his own business after being routinely denied employment positions, Ronnie Lynn's grandfather, a World War II veteran, encountered gatekeeping during the second half of the 20th century. Ronnie Lynn. My paternal grandfather, he was a sharecropper in Alabama, and he only had an 8th grade education. But when he came to L.A., I heard how he couldn't find work. He served in the World War II, but couldn't find the job, and he started his own construction businesses, but he would have to get white men to pretend like they owned the company just so he can get work. And that was true from my maternal great-grandfather from Louisiana. He also served in World War II. And when he, moved out here, he couldn't find work. So, I heard stories about how they, even though they fought in World War II, they still were being discriminated against. Several narrators described more contemporary iterations of gatekeeping. Elaborating on gatekeeping at different phases of the employment application process, the man whose blood remembers described that he would be met with enthusiasm over the phone, which would be contradicted when he showed up to the interview. Noting examples of gatekeeping before he could attain an interview, he reflected upon a point in which he considered whether to continue indicating his race on applications. The man whose blood remembers. In some cases, they have a requirement to put your race or not put it. And I was just like, man, it sometimes made me wonder if I was to not put it, would they give me a better chance? But then they probably going to see me. But then I was just like, I can't not be who I am. Like, I can't do that. Because if that's the case, then I shouldn't be there anyway. Even though it's affecting my family and potential for me to grow and advance, I can't try to hide who I am because somebody wants to treat me unfairly. Notably, Frida Day elucidated how she has encountered gatekeeping while navigating hiring agencies. She has found that hiring agencies serve as a gatekeeper by discounting her worth. Frida Day. So even though this was a black company where everyone in reality was actually paid well, in order for me to get the job, I got to deal with this gatekeeper who's going to discount me to a black-owned firm. And it happens. It happened when I left that job and went to that job that I have now. They went through 3 people who were not black, who were horrible. But now you hire the 3rd person who is great. But I got to take the discount because y'all hired two incompetent people before me. Like, how does that work? A white gatekeeper, I got an interview in your house in a very posh part of LA where I can see wealth all around you, and you're discounting me as we sit looking out over the hills like this is the world we live in? I had to leave that job and come back and then command the salary that I deserve, that I should have been paid in the first place. Using their expertise but barring their advancement. Related to gatekeeping was the harm of having the expertise expected but the opportunities provided for promotion and advancement being limited. Often, narrators' ideas or expertise were used while either their 1. Responsibilities disproportionately increased relative to coworkers without commensurate compensation, or 2. Ideas were adapted while excluding them from the process. Disproportionately increasing responsibility without compensation. Of the 7 narrators, 3 described examples of being expected to work additional responsibilities relative to others at work, often while making the same or less than their coworkers. Noting the barriers that he had navigated to reach his position, including instances in which he was more qualified than those with more specialist positions, the man whose blood remembers felt the need to frame his professional advice discreetly. The man whose blood remembers. I went to one meeting and they had someone who was supposed to be a specialist on something. I didn't want them to see because I had more experience in it. And so they really wanted to lead into training, and I didn't want them to feel like less than, so I framed it a certain way. I even approached trying to give them guidance to where I posed it as questions. So then it gave them an opportunity to answer more so, and then for me to just add to it. And so they actually was really happy, instead of me being able to correct them because he should have known some of those things. But I don't want to ever make anybody feel like I was made to feel on a regular basis, even though I was actually the qualified person. When the man whose blood remembers expertise was perceived, he was routinely placed in employment positions that prevented him from progressing. Multiple times he was asked to train several of his superiors. At one point, while working in construction, his employers even attempted to reassign the sites he was supervising so he could help his new boss supervise his own. Frida Day described a similar experience while working in accounting. Despite having both a college degree in her profession and regularly advising her coworker, Frida Day was paid less than the coworker she advised. Frida Day. But a woman again who was trained up in this profession, who did not know accounting, who cannot do some of the things that I can do, she was making $10,000 more than me. And she asked me, quote, "Do you know how much money I make?" End quote. I said, quote, "No," end quote. She said, quote, "Well, I know how much money you make. You should be making the same, if not more than me, because anytime I need to know something, I come to you. You have a degree and I don't," end quote. So I've been at this now for 30 years, and I've been with this company since 2015. And I've literally had to leave in order to come back on the terms that I should have had when I came through the door in the first place. Attempting to justify why she'd given the only 2 black women on her staff noticeably larger caseloads than others, Violet Allen's manager characterized them as, quote, "workhorses," end quote, who get a lot done. Yet, when special assignments arose, which often provided pathways for promotion, neither Violet Allen nor her colleague was ever afforded an opportunity. Interviewer. And when people were given these special assignments, there wasn't any sort of criteria that they explained about how they chose who was going to have this assignment? Violet Allen. Not to my knowledge, because I recall asking to be placed on an assignment, something, interesting, different, noteworthy. And I never really could ascertain what criteria was used to place folks in these assignments. I do recall asking this guy, name removed, who was in charge of a special project. I asked him, quote, "How do you choose the judges for your project for these particular cases?" End quote. And he said it was who he liked. Adapting ideas while excluding them from the process. Consistent with the accounts of gatekeeping and limited opportunities for advancement, one narrator demonstrated how ideas matching her own were adapted to create a novel office, but she was deemed ineligible to apply for the specialist position in that office. K. Move. Even if we remove the fact that I wrote a grant, which ended up being the blueprint of what this office looks like, I had direct experience. In 2017, K. Move submitted a proposal for the City of Sacramento's Creative Economy Grant after the city called for ideas to bolster the creative economy. after earning 2 degrees, an associate's in television production and broadcast journalism, and a bachelor's in communications, working for her local public broadcast service, the Sacramento Film Commission, and the Communications News Division of the California Farm Bureau Federation. K-Move proposed an idea. K-Move. My idea was all about a city-sanctioned film office that would provide local resources and assistance to filmmakers in grant making. You know, get databases together of the crews and filmmakers in town. And they actually put that office together, but they would not even give me the chance to interview for that position. K-Move submitted her application and resume for the specialist position in the new office, which was consistent with the ideas she had proposed in her grant application. However, she was not invited to the interview. She spoke to a black filmmaker who received an interview and described his interviewers as disengaged before they cited his insufficient work history. K-Move. If you knew he didn't have enough work history, why are you interviewing him? If that's automatic, why are you interviewing him in the first place? And here I am with direct experience and a ton of work history. At the time that I applied for the field office job, I had been at the California Farm Bureau for 10 years, so I definitely had a track record and work history. And it just seems like they picked somebody that they would easily be able to tell no. Lack of social capital. Gatekeeping and minimal opportunities for advancement correlated with limited opportunities to develop social capital. As reported, when Violet Allen inquired about the criteria used to distribute special assignments, one person in authority told her he chose those he liked. Violet Allen indicated that having few people to explain how these social systems worked created obstacles. Violet Allen. When there are not very many black folk, specifically black Americans, within a department, an agency, an institution, then the ability to kind of explain processes and how to move up are not there. Commenting on the intersections of race and class, Ronnie Lynn, a professional within Hollywood, also contended that the absence of social networks removed safety nets for making mistakes. Thus, those who are less connected are required to maintain exceptionalism. Ronnie Lynn. I feel like Hollywood reflects society, like it's about relationships, right? People whose parents went to college with someone who's already established. But as a black American, many of us, some of us, are still the first generation to go to college. We don't have those sorts of connections because of the history. But I've seen white kids whose families, they have these sorts of connections because of their privilege, and it helps. They get away with a lot. Let me just say that. They can make a mistake, and it will be overlooked. You make a mistake, and it's judged harsher. It's harder for you to get promoted, and it's harder to make it because it's such a competitive industry. Having resources like connections and money make a difference, and if you're just starting out at the bottom and you don't know anyone, you get vomited out. Similarly, Frida Day experienced the impact of a lack of social capital from the beginning of her career to the point at which she began her business. From the beginning, a senior partner made the deliberate decision not to give her mentorship shaping her opportunities. Frida Day. I had the senior partner come to me and tell me, quote, "You are too smart. You are the kind of person who, if I train you, you're going to take everything you are going to learn and you're going to leave," end quote. So this man mentored many people, but what I was told is that I was too smart. Subsequently, when Frida Day began a firm with her business partner, another black woman, they found that despite their expertise, consistent mentorship for young professionals, and the ability to keep accounts in the black, due to their lack of social connections, they could never grow to profitability due to undercapitalization. Frida Day. It was a business management practice, an accounting office for high net worth, high profile people. I had walked away from that company that I was with an anchor client. We knew we needed 2 anchor clients to sustain the business, and we thought we had a second anchor client, and then that guy wound up stiffing us. But when you have a small practice, people want you to be discounted, and I understood that in a way, but our skills are the same. My skill set didn't change because I changed location. But when we came to that realization, we decreased our hourly billing. But in terms of being a retainer client, those numbers are not going to change much. Home and land ownership. The man whose blood remembers. Just something simple, just to be able to have a home for my family. Like that was just the goal. A home in the area that I grew up in, that my family had been to since the 1940s. That's just what I wanted. I don't need to have the best car, like I just want my kids to be able to have a home, and it was too hard to get. Consistent with the personal testimonies submitted via box, the challenge of attaining and maintaining land and home ownership was the second most significant theme in the oral history interviews. In addition to discussions about redlining and segregation, narrators went into depth about historical and contemporary home and land ownership harms related to inherited property, urban planning and development, corporate interests. Inherited property. As a child, Violet Allen looked forward to visiting her mother's family every other year in Rapides Parish, Louisiana, where they collectively owned 40 acres of land. From the time she was about 8 years old, Violet Allen recalls her mother receiving letters annually from an attorney requesting that she sell her inherited portion of the family land. Her mother refused for over 50 years until, in 2012, she received a notice of petition to partition the land. Violet Allen, the individual who is a veterinarian out of my mom's small hometown, had been purchasing pieces of my relative's portion of the land. And so this individual had such a large interest that it was not financially feasible for us to continue to fight in order to maintain the very small portion that was left. He was able to acquire roughly 30 acres of the 40, leaving 10 small acres for the remaining family members. So he was able to go to court and file what's called a petition to partition the land and to force the sale of the land so that he could not only maintain his 30 acres, but he could then force the sale of the 10 remaining acres and then give the remaining heirs a small monetary compensation for their portion. When they attempted to defend their land, Violet Allen used her legal expertise to organize her family, find an assessor and an attorney in Louisiana, and draft documents to fight the sale. However, the process was too far gone when the family realized what had been happening. Illustrating the distinct vulnerability of individuals who inherit property and the fact that even with her expertise, navigating the legal process surrounding the inherited property proved difficult. Given this difficulty, Violet Allen is an advocate for the right of first refusal. Violet Allen. I think we should have been given the right to first refusal. That should be a law that before my cousin can sell to Jim Bob, my cousin must give me the right to buy it. If I decide no, I don't want to buy your portion, then you can sell to an outsider. That's something that's not allowed, or that's not typically done with respect to heirs' property. And then all of the heirs should be advised that Jim Bob has presented cousin A, B, C, D with offers to sell the land. We were completely kept in the dark, and we're talking about people who are just coming out of Jim Crow. Without access to lawyers, I was the first lawyer in my family. I am the only lawyer in my family on both sides. My mom had 11 siblings, which means I had hundreds of cousins. I am the only lawyer on both sides of my family. Violet Allen lived out another issue associated with inherited property when her father and his siblings decided to sell their late mother's property in Texas. Despite her efforts to buy the land with her two cousins, several obstacles prevented her from purchasing it. Violet Allen. The rough valuation of the land was probably about $100,000, and I told him that I wanted to buy it, and I don't have a whole lot of money, but I was willing to do whatever I needed to do to buy the land. And so I contacted my cousin in Arizona, two cousins in Arizona. One is a vice president at a bank. Another one is a police chief, got money, and I said, you guys, let's go into it together. Let's purchase this together. It's land right next to Whole Foods Market, right next to Harley Davidson. You know, it's valuable. So my cousin starts investigating, and he finds out that we cannot get a mortgage on the land. I believe the reason was because there was no home on it. And so, if we were to buy it, we'd have to buy it in cash. Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, okay, yeah, that's a risk. But let's still do it. Then the second issue that came was that even if we purchased it, we couldn't find anybody who would insure us. And I forgot there was a specific reason that they would not insure the land, and it escapes me. But it was something along the lines of it not being the type of property that was insurable for most insurance companies. So I was running the risk of, if I buy this land and I erect something on it, then you're talking about losing a life's savings when I'm a single mom. I'd love to be able to send my daughter to college. I can't risk investing in this property and not being able to insure it. So ultimately, I decided that I could not, as an individual woman, purchase this land, although I wanted to. And then the third issue with this land is that Whole Foods and Harley-Davidson advised us that my grandmother never owned all of the land. A portion of it belonged to someone else. In fact, they were claiming that a portion of it belonged to them. And so there would be litigation, fighting title, or establishing title to the land. Knowing that I have the issue of it not possibly being insurable, not with me not being able to hold a mortgage on it, and then me possibly having to battle a title fight with Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, I don't care how smart I think I am, I don't have the financial wherewithal to fight that kind of power. So Daddy and all of his siblings sold the land. Inherited property in California. Foundational Black Americans interview echoed the phenomenon of heirs unwillingly losing inherited land. Connected with his family's history in California among the Black pioneers, Foundational Black American described a concerted effort to erase records of Black land ownership. Foundational Black American. It was a book that was written by, I believe, Karen L. Robinson. The book was titled Gaining Ground: African American Landowners in California, 1848 to 1860, and was actually her master thesis. And it's at Arizona State University. That's the only copy left on campus. It has to be checked out by students. And that particular book really spoke about the African American pioneers of California that were landowners from 1850. California began a state, or the Union, until 1950. And it showed an extreme decrease and then land ownership of these African Americans. And I just find it interesting that that book was pulled out of circulation. And the only way I was able to get a copy or actually get the information from the book was to have a student at Arizona State go into the library, check it out, and take pictures. But I was stunned because a lot of this history, you have to go higher education to learn it. And I don't even call that critical race. I call it just teaching thorough history. And so if we taught that history and it wasn't hidden, one would then question, well, what happened to all the Black landowners? My family is living proof of what happened to all the Black landowners. We just happen to have the deeds that were not destroyed. The deeds to which Foundational Black American referred are those detailing his great-grandfather's ownership of land in Coloma, California, which was ultimately seized under eminent domain. Foundational Black American. For my grandfather to come home from fighting for his country and be told, quote, "You're going to sell your land, boy," end quote, because they called them boys back then, quote, or "You're going to be jailed," end quote. Now that came from the archives. The Department of Justice actually shared that with me. Legislation was actually created to take land from my family, and they took land. Why? Well, I began to read documents. There was gold still there. When my relatives said, quote, "No, you guys can't dredge up my land," end quote, they wrote in the newspaper, quote, "Negroes surely to lose against the state of California," end quote. Despite acknowledgments about his family's ownership, Foundational Black American attests that none of the lands have been restored. Thus, the through line between Violet Allen and Foundational Black American stories is that even when Black families have attained land ownership, maintaining ownership across generations has consistently been threatened. Urban planning and development. Continuing the theme of urban development, one narrator illustrated the hardships created by development projects that directly target or exclude black communities. Building through black corridors. Frida Day. My children's grandmother purchased a home over by where they built the 91 freeway for $14,000. That house didn't achieve his highest level of appreciation because they put the freeway literally at the end of the block. The freeway went through the end of the block. Well, you know that had racial implications, as did the 110 freeway. The 10 freeway and all of these freeways that became built went through black corridors, so the house didn't really appreciate much in value. Ultimately, leaving California to purchase a home in Texas allowed her children's grandmother to pay cash for a home. However, the narrator emphasized the importance of such implications. Many who are likely to be eligible for lineage-based reparations in California, should they occur, have immigrated due to hardships experienced in California. Levittown and racial covenants. Pointing to the example of Levittown, Frida Day indicated that urban developments that have deliberately excluded African Americans have also created hardships for black home ownership. Her great-grandmother moved into the Kingsborough housing projects, a primarily black housing project in New York in the early 1940s. She lived there most of her life. By contrast, when suburban development projects called Levittown were constructed, often with racial covenants, residents who lived in white housing projects were afforded access to social mobility. Frida Day. For my great-grandmother, there was no daggone Levittown for black people. She wasn't able to move out of the projects and into some other housing that was different. My grandmother lived in the projects until she moved into a nursing home. Contemporary housing harms, corporate interests. Denial of mortgage modification during the 2008 housing crisis. Before the 2008 housing crisis, Violet Allen bought a home in the Southland Park area of Sacramento, California. Wanting to live in her childhood community near her aging mother, yet unable to secure a home in the once predominantly black community she grew up in, Kay Move used an inheritance from her aunt to put a down payment on her home in another area. She then left California to care for her dying grandmother. When she returned to California amid the housing crisis, she secured a mortgage modification with her lender. Kay Move. When I first bought the house, I was paying $4,400 a month. I had a first and a second mortgage. Like I said, I had some inheritance from my Louisiana family. So we were able to keep up that payment, $4,400 a month, for a year. And then at that time, we refinanced and were able to get a little bit less than $3,700 a month. But it was still deemed that the property was underwater. So looking to get the modification with Chase Bank, they finally agreed to it. And they sent a trial modification contract for $1,488 a month. And I'm like, okay, so this is something I can work with, even with my underemployment and the inheritance running out. Despite paying her mortgage every month for 2 years under the presumption that the modification would become permanent, her mortgage was ultimately sold to another lender, beginning the modification process anew. Kay Move. There was this algorithm where you had to be making, X amount of money over your mortgage price in order to even be considered for modifications at a lesser rate. So it's like the more money you made, the better modification package they would give you. At one time, they were offering interest rates at 2%. My modification ended up being at 4%. But they also had something they were offering called principal reduction. They were paying off $100,000 or even half of people's mortgages, just paying that off. But only if you make enough money. And I'm like, if I made all this money, I wouldn't even need a modification. I would just pay the bill. I wasn't thinking about it in these terms at the time before I got into my advocacy work. But it's like, okay, well, if black people are, the data is showing that they're underpaid. And most situations that their median incomes is like $40,000 or under. So they set the rules so that it's unattainable. Over the years, K-Move's mortgage was sold to multiple lenders who engaged in practices such as increasing her payment by $100 without notice and subsequently refusing to accept her payment. After falling into default, the lender foreclosed on K-Move's home, and it was nearly sold. K-Move: my house was on the auction block. I couldn't go because I had to work, but I did have a friend go for me. And he said that it was like a scene from the movie Men in Black because it was all these private investors with earpieces and talking. And they were calling the houses, and then the people would bid on them. Not just normal people going to try to buy a house, but these were private investors, and that's a big problem. Sacramento sold a large swath of the housing inventory to these private investment firms like BlackRock. So they buy up the properties, and then everybody has to go in as a renter. And then they're charging exorbitant prices for rent. So that's how we ended up in that situation. But he said it was basically like a scene from the movie Men in Black. And he said they called my house, and then they were like, oh, no, this one has to stay on it. So this one won't be sold today, but that's how close my house got to being sold out from under me. Corporations buying up single-family homes. Consistent with K-Move's account, the man whose blood remembers describes how in the current housing market, investors and corporations are continuing to overbid for homes that enter the market. That practice makes it virtually impossible for individual families to buy homes, even in neighborhoods in which they have always lived. As an aspiring small business owner in real estate, the phenomenon also meant that the man whose blood remembers previous work to position himself to begin his business was moot. The man whose blood remembers. Basically, people who have like billions of dollars and stuff, they're purposely purchasing any homes that come on the market. They will purposely purchase it at a higher rate so that basically can end up driving the market. So that's happening. They only build a certain amount of homes at a certain time, which causes overbidding. And so that then when someone overbids, and it happens multiple times, they can now use that as like the point of value. There was some homes that I was actually attempting to try to buy, and that was one of the things they did. When they started off, it was like $300,000 for certain homes, and then they would only build a certain amount. And they would have you go through this process where you're waiting, and then you try to buy it, and then someone bids like $100,000 extra. I don't have that type of money. I did all this work to get in this position to finally be able to almost bid in this. Now something new is put in place too, where I still can't, because now people are coming up with $300,000. I can't compete with that. My family don't have money like that. I barely got to a position where I can even almost try. Psychological and emotional trauma. The impact of psychological and emotional trauma was another dominant theme across the interviews. One of the repeated notions was that when recounting past harms, there's a reluctance among elder African Americans to talk about their experience. The man whose blood remembers. She, his grandmother, who was a sharecropper as a child, encountered a lot of racial racism. But I think for her being so young and encountering it, she didn't really look at it for being that. But when she shared the story, which was difficult to get, from what I've been seeing, some of the older generations don't really like sharing some of their experiences. So it kind of took a lot to get her to talk about it. But then she didn't want to really take a deep dive and think on it too much, which is understandable because it was so traumatizing. Ronnie Lynn, my elders were very religious or Christian, so that's how they dealt with it, was through their faith. Black Americans were super into the church. That was how they dealt with their pain. It was through the church, through community. But there was clearly harm, trauma. It was just something you didn't talk about. The older black people, that's how they dealt with it. They will go to church 3-4 times a week. They will yell, scream, and just the assurance that they believed in God was with them. Notably, in both instances, narrators are describing the impact of the psychological trauma on their elder family members. That is, the experience of trauma limited their elders' ability to talk about the struggles they have undergone and thereby limited these narrators' ability to understand their family histories. Among the narrators who described their own psychological trauma, they were able to speak more about the specific origins of their trauma and what the experience of trauma looks like in their lives. For one narrator, his trauma originated from being forced to continue facing the land ownership harms that took his family's land. Foundational Black American. The trauma that I mentioned when we talk about slavery, I can't relate to that because I just can't. But the trauma I mentioned is like everything after I think, okay, slavery was legal, it was wrong. There were some cruel things that happened. I didn't live it. But what I do live and what's in my veins are those ancestral ties. When I say trauma, there are sleepless nights. Whether people believe it or not, I've had my great-grandfather come and talk to me and tell me I haven't found all the documents yet. And so, some of that is the lack of trust. I walk through life convincing myself that I have to believe that not all white people are a certain way. I have to look for the good in people, even though the majority of white people are afraid of other white people because they've told me. And they show me what their continued silence of allowing the systemic system to continue on. So those are emotions that I cannot even begin to describe, but it's stress. When we think about why do black men have high blood pressure, have ailments, you know why I'm passionate? Why does my voice fluctuation change? My voice, that's trauma. I don't know any other way to explain it, right? I have to humble myself and suppress feelings and emotions, and that's traumatic within itself. It's actually relieving sometimes to let my voice go up, but I feel like, well, if I do that, I might scare somebody, or I'm going to be titled as the angry black man. That has a cost. That comes with a cost. People say, quote, how do you sit and talk to these people, end quote. And I say, because not everybody did what's being done, but it's trauma. When I hear white people tell me, quote, we stand with you, we just have to be silent now, end quote. For another narrator, her trauma sourced from going through the process of filing a suit against the state of California based on racial and gender discrimination. In addition to her diagnosis with nerve damage following her experiences of harassment, she illustrated the emotional toll that fighting the case itself took on her and her family. Interviewer. And one of the things that you mentioned is in deciding to accept the settlement. You wanted to be able to be a mom again, to the degree that you feel comfortable. What ways did you find that focusing, working on your case, took you away from being a mom? Violet Allen. Depression. I was very depressed. I was unable or just failing to engage in a way that and at that level that I did. I think when I had my daughter, one of the things that I always wanted her to know was that when she entered the room, that I was happy to see her, that I was joyful to see her, that her just entering the room would light me up and light up my life. And when I was going through this process, I found that I was very unhappy and that when she entered the room, I wasn't joyful. Just her presence would literally bring me joy because I wanted this child so badly and I have this beautiful baby. And so when I was going through this, just not engaging in a way that she deserved. Failure to acknowledge true history. One of the final major themes across the interviews was the harm associated with failing to acknowledge history in its truth. Some narrators connected this failure specifically to experiences in education in which history was deliberately obscured, such as the man whose blood remembers description of his teacher explaining the Civil War as an issue of states' rights. However, many more connected a failure to acknowledge history more broadly. Often, this theme occurred concurrently with the theme relating to inaccessibility to data and records. As noted, Foundational Black American describes how histories of black land ownership in California and limitations on access to records, which illustrate the land ownership, has both limited his ability to learn about his own family and erased the contributions of other black pioneers. One narrator connected this lack of knowledge of African American history and their contributions to the U.S. to a sense of shame and lack of purpose for many African Americans. Ronnie Lynn. For me, as a Black American, I felt like growing up, we were made to be ashamed of who we are as Black Americans. I was always hearing Black Americans talk about Egypt. Oh, we're Egyptian. It was just something to make us feel like we've done something. And it was just having this obsession with trying to prove that the first Egyptians were Black instead of us being proud of what our families built here. You know, we can never just be proud of who we are as Black Americans. Like, I love the fact that, I'm of African descent, but I also felt like we were told made me feel like Africa was better than what we built here. Character. Like, we were ashamed that our ancestors were slaves. But for me, what helped me was just accepting that my family built their own culture here. And they, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Like, they overcame such great obstacles. We get judged a lot as Black Americans. We were always told we don't work hard enough. We're always complaining. We don't value education. And the history says otherwise. History says that Black people built their own schools, HBCUs. History shows that Black Americans fought for public schools, so everybody can get a free education. But yeah, you have immigrants who come here and white people who say, well, why don't you just do what Asian Americans do? They go to college. And people don't know our story. I feel like a lot of Black Americans, they don't have a sense of purpose because they don't value their legacy. They don't value what their families went through. They're looking outward just for validation. So, for me, definitely teaching history in a way that centers our identity, instead of us. I think like Black Americans just need that space. Additional findings and closing thoughts from narrators. Connected to the dominant themes of harm detailed above, home and land ownership, education, employment, psychological and emotional trauma, and failure to acknowledge true history, the narrator's stories also reflected several additional themes, but to a lesser extent. Health harms connected to employment. While health harms did not emerge as a dominant theme, notably, most of the health-related harms described were linked with employment. The two most prevalent sub-themes were issues around taking health-related leaves and employment conditions that correlated with injury and fatality. Of the 4 women who were narrators, 3 of them described issues with taking employment leaves related to medical conditions. Additionally, each of those 3 women described employment situations experienced by themselves or their family members which correlated with injury and, in the worst cases, fatality. Inaccessible or inadequate government services. Specifically, 4 areas were mentioned regarding inaccessible or inadequate government services. 1. Denied benefits for Black veterans under the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. Relating the experiences of her 2 grandfathers, Ronnie Lynn described how despite their service in World War II, neither was able to access the benefits of the GI Bill. Moreover, once they came to California, both experienced difficulty getting jobs despite their service. As mentioned, her paternal grandfather ultimately launched his business after being unable to find work. Nevertheless, he frequently had to hire white men to pretend they owned the company. 2. Small Business Administration, SBA loans. The man whose blood remembers found that despite claims that the SBA and the Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA, are professed to help Black and minority business owners, he found little support when referred to an MBDA affiliate organization for support. He remarked, quote, "The MBDA have these other government organizations that's connected with them." But one of the groups that they referred me to was actually called ASIAN, Asian. That was the name of the organization. It was actually spelled Asian, and it actually meant something because it was connected with one of the groups that's supposed to help me get a loan. And of course, they didn't give me nothing, End quote. 3. Services for working caregivers. As a working single mother, Frida Day experienced the challenges of those who make too much to qualify for support services relating to housing, childcare, or health care, but cannot make enough money to afford all these expenses, especially when they're caring for multiple generations. In discussing these challenges, she described the need for a sliding scale and more support for families caring for Black elders who have lived through years of hardship that contribute to health disparities. 4. Legal representation for parolee candidates. During her 5 years as a parole revocation attorney with the California Parole Department, Violet Allen observed what she characterized as the frequent lack of a zealous defense. She noted, quote, "An inmate had a specific period of time within which he or she could be on parole. Let's say it was 4 years. I found that the board was holding inmates after this 4-year mark. This information would come to the attorney's knowledge, but rather than challenge that and push for the inmate's immediate release, it would be something where the attorney didn't want to rock the boat in order to not get work. You want to continue to get work, so parole revocation work became an economy fueled off of maintaining folks in prison." End quote. Civil and military service consistently reflected in personal histories. It's notable that as they spoke about their family and personal histories, every narrator's history reflected a commitment to military or civil servants to their country as teachers, judges, municipal workers, and soldiers. Bishop Porter proudly spoke about the feats of military bravery for which 2 of his relatives had been honored. Kay Move, while priding her parents' work as lifelong civil servants, also mourned her father's premature death from a brain aneurysm at the age of 59, which his co-workers attributed to hidden stressors on the job. Belief in repairing America as a whole. Finally, the narrators echoed the sentiment that they wanted harms to be acknowledged and repaired, not only because of what has happened to the descendants of slavery, but because the contributions of Black Americans have made and can make with reparations have integrally shaped the nation for the better. Thus, they believe that providing reparations to the descendants of slavery was not just an effort to repair Black America, but to heal the nation as a whole. The Man Whose Blood Remembers. Quote, "I really do believe if you fix the descendants of slavery in America and the government actually do what they're supposed to do, it actually allows the U.S. to say and show we were actually willing to clean up our own messes. We were willing to be the country we said that we were when we said liberty and justice for all." End quote. Section 5. Public opinion surveys on reparations, proposals, and eligibility analysis and findings. This section reports findings from the statewide surveys to assess public opinion on reparations proposals and on eligibility. The findings are reported for the statewide representative sample in California and for those who completed the survey through the community listening sessions process. The survey results are provided with a focus on the following 2 major areas of inquiry: support for reparations and who should be eligible for them. Data. The Bunch Center designed a close-ended survey that queried a representative sample of Californians about their support for reparations proposals and their opinion about who should be eligible for that support. The sample consisted of 2,449 individuals from across the state who were over the age of 18 and was conducted from May 10, 2022 to June 6, 2022. A proportional stratified sampling frame of the American Community Survey, ACS, 1-year estimates of California was used to mirror the state's demographics in terms of age, ethnicity, gender, and race. The research team at UCLA designed the web-based survey, and it was administered by Lucid Holdings Marketplace, a third-party source. In addition, the Community Listening Session Survey was administered between March and August 2022. This survey was offered to those who either directly participated in the community listening sessions or were connected to the survey by a listening session participant. In total, 1,934 respondents completed the Community Listening Session Survey. The analysis below compares the results of the representative statewide survey to those who completed the survey based on connections to the community listening sessions where appropriate. Methodology. The research sought to understand the level of support for reparations in the state of California. Survey questions were developed based on the suggested reparation measures to address past harm according to the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. Restitution should restore the victim to their original situation before the violation occurred. Restoration of liberty, reinstatement of employment, return of the property, and return to one's place of residence. Compensation should be provided for any economically accessible damage, loss of earnings, property loss, economic opportunities, or moral damages. Rehabilitation should include medical and psychological care and legal and social services. Satisfaction should include the cessation of continuing violations, truth-seeking, search for the disappeared persons or their remains, recovery, reburial of remains, public apologies, judicial and administrative sanctions, memorials, and commemorations. A Likert scale was used to collect respondents' attitudes and opinions on the extent to which the participant agrees or disagrees with reparation measures for eligible Black residents in California. The scale was used to rank survey respondents' level of support by choosing one of the following: strongly support, support, likely support, strongly oppose, oppose, likely oppose, neither support nor oppose, and unsure. For ease of presentation, the responses are reduced to three broad sentiments: support, indifferent, and oppose. The newly defined support category combined the strongly support, support, and likely support responses, while the oppose category combined strongly oppose, oppose, and likely oppose. The indifferent category collapsed the neither support nor oppose category and the unsure category together. For racial atrocities committed in California, our research identified three main categories for reparation remedies: direct cash compensation, monetary, no direct cash measures, and non-monetary measures. In this case, direct cash compensation refers to a one-time cash payment. Monetary measures are a collection of economic and financial proposals that invest in Black communities, such as economic investments, grants, business loans, entrepreneurial investments, education, educational grants, healthcare, expansion of Medi-Cal, housing, mortgage assistance, down payment, housing revitalization grants, loan debt forgiveness, student, mortgage, business, debt relief, and financial resources, universal basic income, baby bonds, annuities, endowments, trust funds. Non-monetary measures refer to proposals such as an apology from the state, curriculum reform, K-12 education on slavery, transatlantic slave trade, monuments, memorials to honor victims of slavery, transatlantic slave trade, abolitionist monuments, and restoration of unfairly seized property land. This section first presents results from the representative statewide sample and then compares them to the results from the community listening session surveys. Key findings: support for reparations. A majority of Californians support all types of reparations measures. Past research has focused on reparations in the form of direct cash payments for harm caused and has shown that support for reparations falls when reparations is defined as such. Although our research finds there is a majority support for reparations in the form of direct cash payments, 64%, support is significantly higher for remedies that include monetary measures, 77%, but do not include cash payments. Support is also significantly higher for remedies that include non-monetary, 73%, forms of reparations. These findings support past research, but show that support for monetary reparations, arguably equivalent to cash in value, is quite high if cash is not included. Despite this, a majority of Californians support a direct cash form of reparations. Below, Support in California for all three reparations measures is explored by key demographic variables. The results show that support for California reparations differs significantly by race, age, educational attainment, and political affiliation. Black Californians are much more likely to support all reparation measures, especially direct cash transfers. Support for direct cash compensation vastly differs by race. Non-Hispanic Black, 86%, support for direct cash payments was nearly 2 times greater than support among whites, 48%, and Asian Americans. Support within the Latinx community for such forms of reparations is fairly strong as well, with nearly 2/3, 61%, supporting direct cash compensation. Still, support for monetary, no cash, measures was the most supported reparations measure across all racial and ethnic groups. Black Californians support this reparations measure the most at 89%, and only slightly more than their support for direct cash payments. Over 3/4, 79%, of the Latinx community indicated support for monetary-based, no-cash reparations measures, while support for this reparations measure for whites, Asian Americans, and others hovered in the 60% range. Still, a majority of these groups supported monetary, no-cash measures for reparations. Further analysis, not shown here, reveals that Black Californians' higher support for monetary, no-cash reparations measures is driven by their strong support for business investments, 82% within Black communities, and educational investments, 81%. Their support for non-monetary reparations measures is driven in part by their much stronger support for the restoration of seized property, 78%, compared to other racial ethnic groups. Younger Californians are more likely to support reparations for eligible African Americans. The survey found that younger Californians support all reparations measures more strongly than older Californians, those older than 45. Age is a particularly significant indicator for the strength of support for direct cash payments as the reparations measure. According to the breakdown provided for the state sample, respondents aged 30 through 44, 74.2%, offered the most significant support for direct cash compensation, followed by roughly 3/4, 73.6%, of those aged 18 to 29. By contrast, only roughly 1/3, 38%, of respondents aged 65 or older expressed support for this measure. There is a similar trend regarding the level of support for monetary, no cash, and non-monetary measures. While a large majority, 83% of people aged 30 to 45, supported monetary cash reparations, support declined 73% with those aged 45 to 54. Similarly, support, 62%, for non-monetary measures was significantly lower for people aged 55 to 64 than among those aged 18 to 29. Women in California are slightly more likely to support reparations for eligible African Americans. The proposal for direct cash compensation was equally supported by men, 62%, and women, 62%. However, support varied in the support for monetary, no cash, and non-monetary measures. Overall, women expressed more support for monetary, no cash reparations measures, 79%, than men, 74%. The greatest difference in support between women and men was regarding non-monetary reparations measures, which women were much more likely to support, 75% of women versus 69% of men. More educated Californians are more likely to support monetary, no cash reparations. With respect to educational attainment, the results from the state sample show that the greatest support for reparations came from more educated Californians, those with a bachelor's degree or more, who supported monetary, no cash reparations at 87% and 85% respectively. While a majority of Californians expressed support for direct cash payments, this support did not vary significantly by educational attainment, except that those with only a high school diploma were less likely than others to support this form of reparations. Democrats in California are more likely to support all measures of reparations for eligible African Americans. Political affiliation had a significant impact on support for reparations. Democrats overwhelmingly expressed the most support for all types of reparations: for direct cash compensation, 73%, monetary, no cash measures, 86%, and non-monetary, 82% reparations measures. In comparison, Republicans supported direct cash payments as a form of reparations, 41%, at a level nearly half that of Democrats and nearly a third less than independents. However, a majority of Republicans indicated support for monetary no-cash reparations measures, 58%, and non-monetary measures, 52%. There was also strong support for monetary no-cash reparations measures from Democrats, 86%, and independents, 71%. The level of support for reparations differed between the California statewide sample and the community listening session sample, but only for those non-black. Figure 14 compares the results from the California statewide representative sample and that from the community listening sessions. It is important to note that well over 90% of those who attended the community listening sessions were black. Significant differences were seen in the level of support for reparations across these samples. To begin with, support for direct compensation, 96%, was significantly higher in the community listening session sample than in the state. There was a nearly 30 percentage point difference in the level of support between the community listening session sample and the state representative sample for this form of reparations. Respondents in the community listening session sample were also much more likely to support monetary, no cash, and non-monetary reparation measures when compared to all Californians. However, the differences in support for reparations were smaller when comparing the levels of reparations support between black respondents in the statewide sample and the community listening session sample, which was overwhelmingly black. Black respondents from the statewide sample shared a perspective with those who participated in the community listening sessions regarding support for most reparation measures. Nearly all participants from the community listening session sample, 91%, supported monetary no-cash measures, as did a large majority of black respondents, 89%, from the state sample. Moreover, the level of support for non-monetary measures, 88%, from the community sample was nearly the same as black respondents, 84%, from the state sample. The one slight deviation in these observations was support for direct cash payments, where support for this form of reparations is more strongly supported, by a margin of 10 percentage points, by community participants than by black residents in the state. Eligibility. There was a difference in opinion regarding eligibility for reparations between the statewide and community samples. The survey also queried respondents about their responses to questions regarding who should be eligible for reparations in California. The opinions about who should be eligible for reparations differed across the statewide sample, the community listening session sample, and black residents in the statewide sample. A plurality of respondents in the statewide sample supported reparations for all black people, 30%, followed closely by support for lineage-based reparations, 29%. Lineage-based reparations refers to people who are descendants of those enslaved in the U.S. In the statewide sample, 24% believed that reparations should be for those black people who experienced race-based discrimination. On the other hand, 67% of respondents in the community listening session sample supported reparations for people who descended from those enslaved in the U.S., lineage-based, while 18% supported reparations for all black people. Black Californians were in the middle of responses when compared to both the overall statewide and community listening session samples. Black Californians indicate nearly equal support for lineage-based, 40% reparations, and for reparations for all black residents, 39%. Section 6. Key takeaways. The overarching goal of the Bunch Center's Community Engagement Project was twofold. One, give the community voice and allow them to express their concerns, desires, wishes, and perspectives in the conversation about reparations in California. Two, to provide the task force for the study of reparations proposals for African Americans with direct community input as it deliberates reparations proposals. Through three major research activities, the Bunch Center's Community Engagement Project sought to collect and document information regarding race-based harms, support for reparations and their kind, and who should be eligible for them. These efforts included collecting information from community listening sessions that were organized and held by a strong group of community-based anchor organizations, from oral histories and personal testimonies of those who participated in the process, and from a survey developed by the center. This project documented a wide variety of racially based harms experienced as told through various means by members of the Black community in California. Moreover, the members who provided personal testimony or unsolicited opinions and stories at the community listening sessions were in close agreement about how these experiences reduced their quality of life and, in many instances, compromised their mental and physical health. These members also agreed that acknowledgement and recognition of these harms should, at minimum, be publicly made and that the harms warrant serious consideration for restitution. The Bunch Center Community Engagement Project found remarkable similarities in the themes, concerns, and remedies collected across these three distinct research activities. In both the community listening sessions as well as the oral histories and personal testimonies, the types of race-based harms expressed converged. The harms expressed included those related to barriers to educational success, miseducation around racial histories, economic disenfranchisement, criminalization based on race, and race-based harms in housing and labor markets, to name a few. These all led in some way to psychological and emotional trauma. The Bunch Center Community Engagement Project also finds consistency in sentiments about who should be eligible for reparations. The two most mentioned eligibility standards included lineage-based ones or for all Black people. The lineage-based standard referred to those whose ancestors could be traced to those enslaved in the U.S. In contrast, all Black people refers to those who are Black and may or may not have ancestors to trace back to those enslaved in the U.S. Fewer made mention of whether only Black people who experience race-based discrimination should only be eligible. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the remedies proposed, especially in the community listening sessions and through the oral histories and personal testimonies, were remarkably similar. Not only were there calls for and support of direct cash payments, but also for monetary interventions that were not direct cash-based transfers. These included things such as business, education, and community-based investments, debt relief from student loans, mortgages or business loans, and calls for land ownership or return of land improperly confiscated, among other things. They also included identifying non-monetary remedies, including reform of the criminal legal system or reworking school-based curriculums to reflect more accuracy of the Black experience in American history. The survey, designed and administered by the Bunch Center, provided Californians and members of its Black community an opportunity to express their desire and level of support for reparations in measurable ways. In separate efforts, it asked a representative sample of Californians, as well as those who were connected to the community listening sessions, a series of questions about support for different kinds of reparation measures for eligible persons. These measures were grouped into three distinct categories. 1. Direct cash payments. 2. Monetary measures that included no cash. And 3. Non-monetary measures such as apologies or monuments. The Bunch Center Community Engagement Project found that a majority of Californians support all three types of reparations measures. Still, support is significantly higher for remedies that include monetary, no cash measures. Black Californians are much more likely than any other racial and ethnic group to support all three reparations measures, especially direct cash payments. However, they still supported monetary no cash measures at the highest level. Younger Californians, Democrats, and to a lesser extent independents are more likely to support all three reparations measures for eligible African Americans than their older and Republican peers. Combined, these results show strong support in California for remedies that address racial harms to African Americans in California. While most Californians agree on their support for reparations, they are less clear on who should be eligible. Californians, and Black Californians in particular, are split in who they think should be eligible for reparations. By similar percentages, both groups indicate that eligibility for reparations should go to all Black people and to those who are descendants of enslaved people in the U.S. This is in contrast to community listening session participants who were slightly more in favor of eligibility criteria that only included descendants of those enslaved in the U.S. And that will conclude Chapter 32, Parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, Harm and Repair. And now our closing remarks.
And that will conclude tonight's reading of Chapter 32 of the California Reparations Task Force's final report. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to like this video, hit the bell for reminders, subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you go, don't forget, get connected, follow CJEC on all social media, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter at CJEC Official. Get informed, visit www.cjecofficial.org and sign up for current and accurate California reparation news and info. Get on our Get Involved page. Get involved. Support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the homepage of our website. Special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate you all. We are closer to the reparations than we ever been in California. Have a great night.